Welcome to the podcast, Lighting the Educational Flame, created and produced by educator and author Mark Hoberman, owner and director of Grade Success Tutoring. Mark will be joined by Susan Brender, CEO and host of The Susan Brender Show. The purpose of this program is to offer our listeners a variety of stories dealing with many interesting topics surrounding education. It is our hope that students and parents alike will benefit from the wide range of topics, including study skills, test prep, anti-bullying, sports, music, and more. We hope you enjoy our show, Lighting the Educational Flame.
Hello and welcome to the video podcast, Lighting the Educational Flame, brought to you by Grade Success Education on the NETV network. I am Mark Hoberman and my co-host is Susan Brender. How you doing today, Susan?
Good to be on the show with you as always, Mark.
Happy to see you, and even happy to tell you that our special guest today is a special education teacher and consultant, Elyse Verboys. Elyse is actually one of the specialists that works with me at Grade Success Education. Elyse, welcome to Lighting the Educational Flame.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here today.
Great to have you. It's great to actually have a connection with someone and know the ins and outs. And I can just tell you, Susan, that Elyse is such an advocate for children, a phenomenal advocate for the special education population. The district where we were from, a lot of times the parents worked two jobs, had a language barrier, weren't able to understand or know what they were entitled to and when their kids needed help. And Elyse absolutely led the way in that. So I know there are certain things our viewers want to know, Elyse. So first of all, how does a parent know if their child has learning difficulties or if a learning disability, they have one that needs to be addressed actually by a professional?
You know, a lot of that starts right in the home. I mean, the parent is the one who's observing, who is with their child, watching them do homework, maybe even interacting with other kids. So that's usually where it starts. So to answer that part of the question, as the parent starts to feel that, oh, I think there might be some needs my child would benefit from educationally, academically. At that point, the parent might want to just ask a doctor, their pediatrician. If it's an older child, I don't know, my children are in their 20s, they still see their pediatrician. But whether or not the next thing they would want to do is probably speak to a teacher or different teachers that their child works with and ask that teacher if they suspect that there's some learning issues with their son or daughter.
You know, Mark, I'm going to interrupt you again. Sure. and say to Elyse, I'm going to call it a rumor, but it's not a rumor. It's an actual question for you, because a lot of parents are so busy in this particular climate. I mean, they've been busy doing their work, helping out with other things that they're, asked to do. So how did the children benefit from that? Because you know what? The children are alone a lot. And I just wonder, do they help them at all? And if not, who can be the person who is an advocate for them?
So many times if the parent isn't the one that initially notices that there's a learning issue, the teacher is the one that's going to notice and going to see that this student could use some help, speak to the parent, feel out the parent, because it's a very touchy subject and there's a way to go about it when you're talking about your own child. So that's always the best route to take. The teacher so many times is the first person to notice, and if the teacher, not when and if, but the teacher will speak to the parent, because we're always in constant communication with parents. And at that point is when they would bring up, did you ever notice that your child might be a little slower or processing, takes time to process information? And there would be a battery of questions that would be asked at that point.
Right. Susan, Elyse brings up a great point, because I taught an inclusion classroom where I was a teacher and I had an equal special education teacher with me. And a lot of times, when I was younger, Elyse knows me for years and knows that it's not a joke when I say I'm positive I have ADHD, but the diagnosis didn't exist when I was younger. When I was younger, it was, oh, Mark has so much energy and he's paying attention to so many different things. So sometimes some teachers have to worry about jumping on that ADHD bandwagon too quickly. So I'm so glad that Elyse opened up with the parents hopefully notice these things as well. But you really have to have that connection with the school in order to make that happen. So Elyse, who should a parent contact when they notice these things to discuss their child's academic difficulties?
So I would definitely say first, the child's teacher for that particular school year, without a doubt. And then they can have a discussion about, the teacher might want to say to the parent, I will take this to the school psychologist, to the child's study team, and let them make the determination. We'll have a meeting, we'll discuss whether or not, we should go further after we hear what the teacher has to say.
Elyse, you have so much on your plate as a teacher. How can you really do something for these kids with learning disabilities? Because a teacher's role, is not necessarily to be like a parent. It's really to be somebody who gives out information, helps the children with education, and really steps in to do the things that they have to do. So I'm curious, and Mark, I'm curious about it for you. Why do the teachers have to do this? They have enough, don't they?
Well,
So-
go ahead.
All right, is it okay, Mark, if I go first?
Please.
Okay. I will say, Susan, that's a great point. As a special educator, we're so different than the general ed school educator. We are the parent, we're advocates in the community, we're liaisons for different services that a special ed student will have to deal with throughout their time in the program. We keep in frequent contact with parents. I used to keep in contact with parents, not only through, email, on the phone. The phone was the worst because it's so hard to contact anybody usually through using the telephone these days. I would write in a student's notebooks or an agenda, have a special log book that I can communicate with the parents as frequently or infrequently as, needed to be. So a special educator, just to summarize, is so much more than just the teacher in a classroom.
It's exactly what I was going to say. And to piggyback on that, it's funny, Susan, you kind of asked that question in an old school sort of way. I had teachers I remembered when I was younger who I loved, but I could tell you that Elyse and I worked with a population where in the school, 75 to 78% of the people were on free and reduced lunch. Many of them only had one parent at home. That parent might be working 2 or even 3 jobs. There was a language barrier. The love, the connection, the involvement we had in their lives was so needed, so necessary, and so there on a daily basis. We were in loco parenti. We were in place of the parent. And sorry to say that or happy to say, we were able to stop suicides. We've been able to help people get into classes they really needed. In the high school, there was more than one teacher. So you run into a situation where the parent might contact the teacher, but the kid really has problems in 4 other classes, or that teacher didn't pick up on it. And that's where Elyse used to step in with her expertise and ability to talk to the kids and to help parents understand what the problem was.
What about Ritalin? So many kids with learning disabilities have to take Ritalin. And I've had a friend who used to say it is terrible. It really causes the children to be a little bit more, how should I say it, disturbed, if you will. And what about drugs? I want to know about drugs because today drugs are a real problem in the schools as well. And I'm sure that kids, even with disabilities, deal with the drug situation.
So there's a couple of things I want to answer for you here, but I want to make a clarification. A student who has been classified as ADD or ADHD is generally not classifiable for an IEP. That would be more for the 504 plan, because a student with ADD, and I'll get to the medication piece, but a student who has ADD or ADHD diagnosis is usually a student that can function in the regular general ed class, whether it's with medication or not. So I'll get into 504s versus IP if you want me to.
Definitely.
But I want to answer your question first, Susan.
Yeah.
So just understand, a student who's classified, there's 7 main types of LD that are classifiable, and I can get into that as well. But to speak to Ritalin, there's also another medication, Adderall. Years ago, parents were like, okay, if that's what if my child needs that, I'll try the Ritalin, I'll try the Adderall. these medications generally make the students many times very lethargic.
Ah,
Not, you know, and to the point where students would come to me. I taught at a high school for the most part, middle school and or high school. And my students would come to me and say, Mrs. Verboys, I don't, you know, I'm just so lethargic. I can't do the work. This medication is not working for me. There are a lot of things today organically that you can do for an ADD or an ADHD student. And that would be something I would tend at this point to discuss with a parent whose child is possibly on a 504 plan rather than the medications.
So expand on that 504 plan and IEP.
Okay, so a 504 plan accommodates a student who can learn in the general ed setting, but needs certain modifications. So a 504 is guided by the Americans with Disabilities Act, known as ADA, and this plan ensures that a student with a disability has access to certain accommodations that will improve academic functioning. So some of these, also the student to qualify must have a diagnosis from a doctor, whether it's for a physical or an emotional disability, such as we discussed ADD or ADHD. And some of the accommodations would be extra time on tests, which is much easier for focusing. If you think about the student who would need Ritalin or Adderall, they need that extra time to get themselves focused on questions. Sometimes students need a flexible environment. That could be on a 504 plan. So there's a whole list of modifications that a student who needs a 504 plan can have. The IEP, on the other hand, is much more in-depth document for students who are recommended for special ed. This is the student who will be classified because his disability negatively impacts his ability to learn in the regular classroom. This student with an IEP is also entitled to a lot more modifications and accommodations on that IEP, extended time on tests, extended time in the classroom, different classroom accommodations, sitting in front of the teacher. That's also something that's used for a student who has some focusing issues. Put them up front so they're not distracted by too many things in front of them. Specialized instruction is also a modification on an IEP. Related services are also offered to students with IEPs. For example, OT, occupational therapy, PT, a physical therapist, speech and language therapist, counseling services. These accommodations are not part of the 504 plan.
But an IEP is a very serious, almost like a contract, I believe. That it might be an accommodation, but I think they're obligated once that's put in place to provide those services, correct?
Okay, so both documents, 504 and IEPs, are legal documents, and they're both enforced. I mean, if you have a student that you know has a 504 plan, you better enforce that. The same as you have to enforce the IEP. The IEP, though, Mark, as you said, is much more detailed, much more in-depth. One similarity is that the IEP and the 504 plan are reviewed annually. Okay, so during this review, it's to determine, does the student need more or less services? Is the student now ready, being at the high school level, is the student now ready to move out of a special class and start to integrate into maybe one or two mainstream classes with the help and assistance and support of a special ed teacher? And then furthermore, the difference between the 504 and the IEP or special ed student is every 3 years, the student with an IEP has what's called a triennial. So the student at that point is fully tested again, a psychological and an educational evaluation, which is the part that I did in my job. I did all the educational evaluations in the building.
So can that swing from middle school to high school? Someone's diagnosed in 6th grade, 9th grade is the triennial?
Yes. And many times when a student, that's a great point, Mark, because many times a student transitioning from middle school to high school, we test them to see if they even need the services before they move into the high school.
Mark and Lisa, what I want to know is that there are a lot of people in the community, when they hear about these programs that are offered to these kids with different problems, they say, why should we pay for this? Why is it necessary for us to pay from our taxes for this? Have you encountered such a thing?
You know, I didn't realize you were going to say taxes, but a lot of special ed is state funded. That's where a lot of the money comes from, and they're very necessary services. The way students in honor programs have a lot of different services in the higher functioning programs, right? So a lot of the monies come from the state for special ed services. The school is really your best place to have these services met, because that's where the student, your child, is going every day.
Right.
One of the things that was an issue, parents would first want to get their child tested privately, and that's a big expense.
That's a very big expense.
My comment always was to a parent, you know, obviously you do whatever you're comfortable doing. So you always do what's best for your child. You know your child best, which is so true. However, try the school first. Like, speak to the school psychologist. Have your child tested in the school. All you have to do is give consent, and then the school will do that for you for no charge. If you're happy with the way the school has tested your child, and then the going through everything that was you know, found during the testing, and the implementations put into place, and you're happy with the instruction that your child is getting, then why go on? Why go to the outside and get tested?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Okay, so the other question that I have for you, Elyse, is that there are parents who don't accept what they hear from you. They don't like hearing that their child has a problem. How do you address that?
You know, it's such an important question. You know, when you're dealing with a person, first of all, that would be a face-to-face discussion with a parent and with a team of experts. You're always so empathetic, sympathetic to the family. I always predominantly dealt with the learning disabled population, and we came across a certain group of families that didn't believe in classification.
Right.
And that was always difficult, a struggle. But at the high school level, the child himself would say to their parent many times, I need help. You know, we would ask questions. Do you feel that you're behind a little bit in your classes? Where do you feel the need to do better in your classes? Where are you breaking down? And you would ask a series of questions, and eventually I think the parent would understand that, especially if the student was able to say, I have difficulty writing, I have difficulty reading. So that would be one way to definitely handle that situation.
That's true, and I've seen that a lot of times too. You go to you know, and we're not experts. I've seen too many teachers say, your kid is learning disabled. I would never. I've been scolded many times by Elyse in the school, by, you know, and taught how to say the right thing. And, that's the parent. And sometimes the parent, it bothers them more than the child.
Yes.
But in those cases where it does bother the child, Elyse, what's your advice to students with regards to the stigma that often comes with being labeled a special education student? And am I stupid? And I have to leave in the middle of class to take a test. And there's kind of disconnect there and a level of discomfort. How do you advise those students?
So that was always the biggest thing on my plate. And I figured it out many years ago. The best way to start with that, to make a student feel comfortable, is to talk to each student about their disability. And I would always start by saying, does anybody in here have a learning disability? Now, of course, that was only in my classroom, and I was resource room. Yeah. And I would ask, and they would say, no, what are you talking about? And I say, oh, I do. I have one. And I would let the students know, you know, my husband has taught me 1,000,000 times how to watch a football game. And for the life of me, I have asked him to make a chart, write it out, make the field for me on a piece of paper, explain play by play. I still didn't grasp it. I said, I have a learning disability. I cannot pick up that game. And then I would sit with each of the students, and every year I would get their IEP out, whether it was on the computer or, on paper. And I would say, okay, let's take a look at your IEP. This is your disability. Let's take a look at it. What do I mean by this? Well, do you know where you have difficulty in some of your classes? Again, where is your breakdown? And I would go through with each student how they were going to reach their goals to compensate and to learn how to compensate for his or her disability.
Elyse, what are the most common disabilities that you see? I'm sure there are a lot of disabilities. However, I'd like you to tell our audience, and particularly parents, how to kind of see certain things that their children are doing that suggest that they have a problem.
So that brings me to like the 7 main types of LD that you look for. The first one would be dyscalculia, which is with math. I believe I said that right. Dysgraphia, which would have to do with writing skills. If your child's handwriting is illegible, back to the dyscalculia. Am I saying it right?
Dyscalculia sounds good to me. We'll go with that one.
Dyscalculic.
Right.
If you see your student is having difficulty with numbers, reading numbers, incorrectly writing them wrong, which would go back to the dysgraphia. Dyslexia is when you're reading and you're seeing things backwards, like a P for a D, or, so on and so forth. Nonverbal skills. A lot of students are not really, you talk to them and they can't even respond to a question. Oral and written language is another LD. If students have difficulty understanding when you speak to them, in the expression, written language, not really grasping how to write something or read, or again, reading skills are also another thing. Now, the reading is broken down into 3 different parts. So if somebody says to you, my child has a reading disability, okay, what does that mean? Is it a reading comprehension disability? Is it a reading decoding, meaning being able to read words? Or is it a reading fluency issue? Because many times a student has like excellent comprehension skills, but has poor fluency and decoding skills. So you really have to zero in. So all those things, is that a lot for a parent to look for? Yes and no. You can see your child's writing and see if there's an issue with it.
Does dyslexia fall into any of those categories, Elyse?
Yes. Dyslexia, I think, was one of the categories I mentioned.
Oh, okay, yeah, because I know I'm close with someone, a family whose son has dyslexia, and it was quite troubling. And he's actually at a school now where all of the students have the same kind of issues that he does. It's not the whole gamut that you just mentioned, but that's hard sometimes to discern, because you can't tell always what's in their brain. Yeah, if they write a B backwards, which they tend to do in 1st and 2nd grade, that kind of thing. But, famous celebrities supposedly have dyslexia. Cher, I think possibly Tom Cruise and some others. But yeah, it's a very difficult thing to discern and then to deal with it once you do get that diagnosis.
There are ways to test for dyslexia. And then once you find that out, I worked with many students who were so smart, because the average learning disabled child is an average to above average student. It's just learning where your disability is, how to deal with it, and learning the compensatory skills to address your learning disability. And the more proficient you become with your compensatory skills and using them all over and over, you'll be able to compensate within no time, because you draw from your strengths to help your weaknesses. And that's what this is all about. So a good special ed teacher, and I will say that I was very successful with my students, and I'm very proud of that.
As you should.
Thank you. Even though I complimented myself first.
That's okay. I'll second that. I'll second that. She was great.
Mark, let me ask you something. When you had kids in your class with disabilities, were they bullied? Did other kids take advantage of them?
I have to tell you that Elyse and I were in a very special place. special for some bad things, special for some phenomenal things. I never heard anyone call anyone fat. I never heard anyone make fun of anyone for their accent. I never heard anyone make fun of any, but I could tell you that is not the case in many of the other schools. Part of what Great Success does is we go into schools also, and even sleepaway camps and day camps, we deal with anti-bullying presentations and things of that nature. And it really abounds in other places. We were just, I remember we had a colleague, Paul Shapiro, who always said our school was Rockland County's best kept secret because we excelled at so many things. So I didn't see that bullying to that extent. But just to talk to you about, my own son was tested years ago, and I relied on Elyse and one of our other colleagues to help me through that. Even though I was an educator, now I'm dealing with it as a parent, and my son did not like the medication and did not react well on it. But years later said, 10 years later, I'd like to go back on. I'm having trouble focusing and concentrating at work, but now his body can handle it better, intellectually can handle it better. But I went to school one day, and Elise's children and my children went to the same high school. And I went in on open school night, and I'm walking, and my son says to me, "Oh, Dad, that's the Ritalin bathroom." And I said, "Wait a second, you're supposed to take your medication at the nurse's office, not the bathroom." And he said, "No, that's not where they take the medication. That's where they sell the medication."
Wow.
Whoa.
So a lot of these places, if you look at opioid addiction and things like that, a lot of people start with the things that are in their parents' medicine chest. So that's something too. And I've seen bullying in other schools. I'm not saying it didn't exist at our school. I don't think I've seen it more than twice, which is unbelievable. I didn't see that when I taught in the Bronx either, but you bring up a good point, because that's part of the stigma. Because in some schools, when someone gets up, "Oh, there he goes, he's going to the dummy room again. And there he goes, he's getting his extended time," or "Oh, that teacher's here because she's an aide for that student." So that becomes a stigma in itself, which is why I wanted to ask Elyse how she dealt with it. And her answer about talking and breaking it down for the kid and empathizing with them and doing a person-to-person connection, how she may have a learning disability. I believe I had a learning disability in math. And I know how frustrating it is when the teacher's talking and you're not getting any of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Elyse, I'm sure that you see kids with disabilities, a lot of disabilities. Is it worse today than it was before?
No, I don't think so. I think it was always there, but now we know so much more. So maybe that's why it seems worse, but we know so much more. When I was in school, there was a special education class with students that were like ID, it's called now, the term. It used to be MR, but intellectually deficient would be the term now for the students that used to be MR, mentally retarded. And I remember in middle school, I saw these students as a kid myself. I was in the same grade, and all the students in my groups were making fun of them, and I was crying. And I thought, how could you make fun of them? That's when I knew I wanted to be a special ed teacher. I didn't know what I was crying about. But I always felt so bad. I tried to go over and talk to these students because the other kids it was ridiculous. And I would get so upset that the teachers would finally say something to the other students. But in answer to Mark's question, how did I deal with the stigma with my own students? Well, first of all, I always tried to be very friendly with I stood by my door in my classroom, let's put it that way, and I'd be very friendly to the students passing by, regular ed, special ed students. So I got to know a lot of the students in the school that weren't a part of our program, and they would come in and stop by and say, "Oh, miss, I hear you help people. Can you help me?" And I would say, "Sure, come on in." So my students became very comfortable with that. At one point, I was also the cheerleading coach in the school building, and my cheerleaders would come visit all the time and make the kids feel comfortable, like, "Oh, you know that cheerleader," or "How do you know that cheerleader?" So that was also a really good thing to do. And another thing I felt was really important was the inclusion program. Many times I would go into the classroom where my students were. I would have other we would bring some students into our special ed room. I would put some of my special ed students into the regular classroom, just so that they can get that feeling, more for socialization than anything else, and to feel comfortable. And it was great for ego boosting.
Absolutely, and I have to touch upon this as a general ed teacher. So I taught over 30 years, as you know, Susan, and
Yes.
I had many special education children in my classroom who went to resource room, who went to list teachers and special ed specialists, such as Elyse. And I told this Elyse, and I don't think she was shocked when I told her, but when I worked in the Bronx, I never even met the resource room teacher or list teacher of some of my kids. And it wasn't just because we were friendly. I don't remember now. Maybe that's how we became friendly. She would always come in, ask about students because she wanted to hear, she didn't want to be in her own little bubble. And I think that some people who are resource room teachers forget that, we have to work together. And Elyse was definitely the catalyst for that and made us as general ed teachers. I mean, I didn't know all the learning modalities. I learned that through the years. I learned it more through my tutoring business. But Elyse was a major part of that. Certainly, to have that comfort level and have someone you could turn to and ask these questions was a saving grace for me.
And there was a time that in my position there, not a time, always, I was around the building on my free periods, my prep periods, I never free periods. I was meeting with all different teachers, and I did a lot of consulting with teachers through the child study team. And teachers would always come to me and ask, how can I handle this problem or this issue, or what do I do about that? So I was in constant contact with, like Mark is saying, with all the teachers throughout the building. I knew every single teacher in that building.
Well, you know what, Elyse, you mentioned consulting, which you also do for Great Success. So how can our viewers learn more about you and the services that you offer?
Well, of course, through Great Success, and it's www.greatsuccess.com. And I think there's a contact form. There is a contact form to fill out, yes. And that would be a way to get in touch with me.
Excellent. Susan, parting words for my friend and colleague, Elyse Verboys. Where to start?
Elyse, the children that you worked with and also the teachers that you worked with were very fortunate. I think that when you listen to the way you speak about the kids and the way you acted with the kids was truly amazing. And I think Mark and I would say the same thing. It's a pleasure to speak to you and to learn that there are teachers out there that really care for their kids. So it's a pleasure. And I want to say thank you again.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. And just as a little side note, I'm in touch with many of my students still. I have a student who's 40 years old who contacts me frequently.
Yes, Elyse started teaching when she was 5. So she's only 5 years older than the student, luckily. But yeah, absolutely. And I've had those connections too, and it's so special. And I just, I wish I had that kind of connection with a lot of my teachers, but a lot of special people in the school where we're from. So Elyse, seriously, Susan and I can't thank you enough for joining us today and sharing your incredible story, your expertise with us. And viewers, remember to reach out to us on social media. Look for Great Success on Facebook and Twitter. We'd love to hear from you. You can also find me, Mark Hoberman, on LinkedIn. Again, Elyse Verboys, thanks for being with us. Susan, as always, thank you. And viewers, don't forget, you're welcome. Don't forget, viewers, to tune in to our next podcast. This is Mark Hoberman thanking you for watching the podcast, Lighting the Educational Flame, on the Great Success Education channel on NETV. Have a great day, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you for listening to Lighting the Educational Flame with Mark Hoberman. To contact Mark, email him at info@gradesuccess.com.